what seems to be the tipping point. So what seems to tip people into awakening is what you'd call surrender, or the lack of attachment to anything. And then after, once the awakenings happen, like this energetic shifts happen, like you could see it like as breaking a hole in the fabrics of your reality, then there has to be reattachment in order to function as a human. But in order to like fall off the cliff edge, it seems there has to be complete detachment to everything. It's an absolute surrender. And what do I mean by attachment and detachment? Because that can be quite a full-on thing to say. And if you're new to this subject, like you most probably wouldn't be listening to me, but what does that mean? So we have these, no, maybe that's not the best place to start. Where is the best place to start? So all of us, you could say, have something called a character, or an ego, society might call it. And what I mean by that is a sense of self. And everybody's sense of self is different. So some people's sense of self is to be really extrovert, to really enjoy sports, to love being with people, to want to have kids, want to get married, want to settle down, want to live abroad. And then another character or another sense of self might be someone that's really introverted, like things quiet, like order, routine, the same job, small circle of friends. So we all have these sense of selves or personalities or characters. Everybody has it. And we also have in us like a voice inside our head that's talking to us about reality. And we all kind of like don't talk about that too much. That's a little bit weird, that we will have a voice inside our head that's like, and this voice has profound effects on our body. So if the voice is saying, oh God, there's going to be an airstrike and bombs are going to come down on the city and we're all going to die, then the body will be in like nervous anxiety, angst, paranoia, freezing, shock. And if the voice is saying how much they love themselves and how fantastic they are, then maybe there's joy and ecstasy. And it's always yakkering away inside our head, this voice. And it comes with this feeling of being inside the body. It comes with feeling like it's being alive. And it also comes with self-awareness. And it feels like it has the ability to move the self-awareness. So it has the ability, this little voice, to put the self-awareness on the table, on the tip of your nose, to cross your eyes like this, to stick up your hand. And I don't know, maybe we call it the ego just for simplicity. And I'm not saying that's good or bad, the ego. Most of society is like the ego, that's the ego. They're so egotistical. It's neutral. I'm just saying this is something that happens as fact. So we all have this voice inside our head, and the voice affects our emotions, and our emotions affect the voice. There's like a chicken and an egg scenario going on. So if you're feeling very emotional, maybe you've got PMT, or like your dad's just died or your mum's just died or something, and there's more emotions, then it will affect the narrative of the voice. And what happens to most people before they get into spirituality is that voice and the body and the consciousness and the sense of being and your feelings and emotions all create this person called you. And this person called you is separate from the world that it sees. So it's separate from the ground, it's separate from the smells, it's separate from the sights, it's separate from the other people, it's separate from the room. And this separate self is walking through an external world. It's like walking through all these different directions of this universe, and it is separate from others. And a lot of the time when you're totally identified with the body-mind mechanism, with the feelings, that's what I'd call identification. When you're totally identified with it, then everything the voice says is true. And you can't notice the difference between what the voice is saying and what's happening in the world. And that's really hard to remember if you've been into spirituality for a long time. I can't really remember that well. But basically, so if we're in this situation and fear arises and fearful thoughts arise, then maybe that is just seen as really, really, really real. And there's no question that it's not. So for example, say if you're getting stoned and you're smoking weed, there always seems to be this moment in smoking weed where there's the choice, whereas there's a big rush of energy, and there's a choice seemingly to believe you're dying or to go into like an ecstasy or joy. And it's kind of like a collapsing of the self, I suppose, that happens. That doesn't always happen. And the body is changing, so the heart rate might elevate slightly, you might get a little bit like sweaty. That happens on lots of drugs, I presume. It's called like coming up, I suppose. I don't really know all the terminology for it. And yeah, there's this moment. Now, if you're totally identified with the body-mind, you will just think that anything that your mind thinks is true, and it will just go down those avenues. So if you get paranoid, you'll suddenly start thinking that you're having a heart attack, or that there's something wrong with you, or something bad is going to happen, and then you'll get totally invested in that, and it's like that becomes reality, and that becomes real, really real. And then as you begin to wake up, what we call wake up in non-duality, that your thoughts about the experience detach from the experience itself. And there is some part of the thinking mind or the body mind that knows these things aren't true. It still might have a panic attack, but it knows it's not true. And then as it goes further and further down the path, it maybe can redirect it. So it can begin to have control over its thoughts, even though it really can't in the ultimate scheme of things, but it seemingly can direct things. It can see that it's not true, and it can change its mind quite rapidly. And these are all like different stages of being attached and unattached to the person. So in the beginning, there is total attachment to the person, total identification with the person, and everything is real in the personal world. So let me check that everything is working. And everything is real in the personal world. And then as the process of non-duality begins to take hold, the apparent process of non-duality or waking up, is there becomes more and more detachment from things. So before, if you were very driven by your emotions rather than thinking, there is a detachment from it. If you are very driven by thinking, there is a detachment from thinking. There's a part of you that begins to know that what you think isn't true. There's a part of you that begins to know what you feel isn't true. So if you're feeling like sadness, and sadness comes in and everything's coloured, like rather than it being like, that is making me sad, the other person is making me sad, the world is making me sad, I am making me sad, there's some part that's detached from that and knows that's not true anymore. And this really is, in my experience, what the process was, is it's slow detachment from everything you believe to be real. For me, my mind was strong, but it was more the feelings that would come up and seem really real, as if they're real. And it doesn't mean that your feelings and your thoughts don't have like a greater perspective on what's happening. So if you meet someone and you have a feeling like they have dark energy, that could be closer to the truth, but that's a different point. That's a different thing. Like in the detachment stage, you're beginning to see that everything you think and feel isn't true. And then once you've done that, then you can see that there's stuff that's closer to truth and not closer to truth, but you're not identified with it anymore. So this is like this identified energy where it really begins to get pulled into it. And when it's believed to be true, when you're believing yourself to be this body and your thought, the narrator in your mind, the stories that are being told are true, it creates seeking, because as soon as identification and attachment happens, there's always discomfort in the body-mind mechanism. And while there's discomfort, there's always seeking that will appear, which encourages this separation, which encourages the narrator, which encourages the emotions. And this seeking is always saying, there's something in the future which will fix me. So if you're having like a huge feeling of sadness, and then you're projecting it's because your partner doesn't love you enough, and that if you'd picked a different partner, then you'd be loved more and you'd be happier, like so you're off on this bandwagon of this story that you believe, then there is this seeking element in it that believes that it's true. It might be about voiding the past, like you made a mistake and you're an idiot and you should avoid the past. And it might also be like projecting into the future of what it needs or what it wants. But it's like this energy of suffering that comes with it. And this is identification, totally being lost in the person and being lost in these feelings. Often a lot of our feelings and thoughts aren't very conscious to us. So it's also the identification and the attachment to the person is kind of hidden. So we're not really conscious of it. So on the surface level, we're saying the partner doesn't love us enough, he doesn't do the cooking, he doesn't clean up, he doesn't walk the dog, he doesn't do all these things. And then there's this huge sadness and this huge seeking to avoid and fight and try and get his attention and play all these games. And underneath there might be a, what's that word called again? Schema of I'm not good enough to be loved. And that might be very unconscious in the psyche, but that's part of the person as well. It's just not known. So they don't feel good enough to be loved. And so they're always looking out and seeing lack of love. And then that gets focused and narrowed in on the person. And it's like your consciousness and your I am and the person are like so close together. Like this is the consciousness and the I am of who you truly are. And the person is so close together. And it has areas and where it's more attached to. So say if you're very creative and good at your job and you had success in your job, then the person might become very attached to that. They might have an underlying schema that they need to do this in order to fit in. They need to produce and be creative in order to fit in or something. That might be their underlying schema. What they're conscious on the level, conscious on what they can see on the conscious level is this strong urge to work at all costs. So this very like focused urge to work and an over fixation on the success of it, on production, on what other people think. This is just for example. And that becomes part of you, that becomes part of your ego, and it becomes part of your seeking structure. But it's often not conscious. So underneath it might be a deep feeling of not fitting in, an urge to fit in. That's the unconscious part. So that's the lie. And then on the surface, it manifests as working really hard and trying to present these great results, be better than the neighbor, etc., to win. and it feels like a compulsion. It can feel good, but it has a lot of seeking energy, so a lot of discomfort in it. So and every body-mind mechanism will have different areas and where it's attached and other areas where it's not so attached. So no one body-mind mechanism is the same. Normally it would be generational, and it's also genetic. It will be passed on to you, these karmas and these schemas that are playing in your body, and also it's maybe like what you'd call past lives, as in like a random collection of body-mind mechanism dynamics, like sort of collective consciousness that like all gets mushed together, and you end up with bits of this personality and that personality. And that is identification. What happens in waking up is the consciousness and the I am disidentify with the body. Ultimately, when it's really seen, you see that it was never actually identified with the body, it just seemingly was. But it disidentifies with the body, so there is a breaking, and it seems that what happens in that breaking is there, like in loads of reports, there's a surrender, or there's a detachment from the person. And what happens in the person, it looks like, is a surrendering in some way, giving up. It sounds so terrible, like a giving up on everything. So the person really begins to see that nothing in life will ever make it happy. Nothing in life will be its freedom. So, and there's a snap. You could say it's grace, because the person can't force this to happen. Non-duality and the teachings of it can take the body-mind to a certain place where the body-mind can become very relaxed, and the ego, the personality structure, can become very thin. But then there's something that happens where there is a surrender. There is a falling off the cliff edge, not literally, and a letting go of everything. And then the consciousness and the I am break away from the body, and it is recognized who you truly are, that who you are is empty and full at the same time. It is no thing and it's everything, that consciousness is nowhere and all places. You could also say that consciousness is not non-existent. There's simply energy or everything experiencing itself. So it detaches, and there's this massive like oneness experience, but you can't function from my experience, from that pure consciousness perspective. There has to be some identification with the body. And there's that famous like Zen proverb, which is, I'm never very good at quoting things. I have a terrible memory. The proverb is, in the beginning, the mountains are only real. Then they are seen, so then there's the awakening, and they are seen as not real. And then they are seen as real and unreal. I didn't tell it very eloquently. I'm sure it's a poem and a lot more elegant than that. So it's like there's this total disidentification, but then there has to be some identification with the body again in order to function. There's another one about chopping wood. I've forgotten that. Basically, there is a detachment, there is absolute knowing of who you are. And once that's known, it's like there is just an energetic resonance with it in that system. Like the whole world has woken up, and there's a freedom there, and it's recognized. But then there has to be an attachment of going back to the body. Otherwise, I suspect the body just dies. Because it wouldn't do anything. I don't think. It would just sit there blessed out and rot away. Like, that's what happened to Ramana Maharshi. Like, people had to help him. Like, his nails would be all twisted around and rats would be nibbling at him. So then there's to be some form of coming back to the body-mind mechanism. And then, say, maybe before the person was really attached to work, but then afterwards when it comes back, there is some form of attachment to work, but it's not in the same way. It's more in, it's in flow of life, and it's not about getting happiness in the future, because there is a knowing of the happiness that is, but there is some urge, there is some compulsion to do it. And maybe it even has at the bottom of it, when it's re-identified, this little seed of, I fit in if I give work. And there's nothing wrong with that. That's part of being human. Like Khaleesi, who I feel is unidentified. I mean, there's some form of identification with the body, but like she's enlightened, like free. Like she also does no clue who she is. She wants to fit in, and she's got many karmas and schemas going on, just not thought-based. Yes. So what was the original question? Just to bring it back to something. Do you need to let go of everything in order to be free? So there seems to be, that seems to be what happens in awakening. There is a surrender and a letting go of everything. You could call it a death. Happens. And it's not really your activity, so you don't need to worry about it, because the you would never want to let go of things in a way. It sort of happens by itself. A bit like that, you know, the Pac-Man in that game, and then when it ends, it's the Pac-Man's going along eating its ball, and then when it ends, its mouth opens wide and then goes backwards and kind of disappears into nothing, like meow. I think that's how it ends. So I wouldn't worry, like, it's not that you've got to like now let go of everything and you've got to do it. It's something that's kind of happening, and it will take you by surprise. So, yeah. And then at the same time, having said all this, like when there is that detachment, this waking up, this energetic shift, yeah, there's also a seeing that all of this is nonsense. All these words, all these descriptions, all these stories are also nonsense. There's like no attachment left to these things, even though they're spoken about and we talk about it and we have fun and we explore these things. At the same time, it's deeply, deeply known that it's all nonsense. Like all there is right now, which is empty, which is finite and infinite. And it's experiencing itself as everything. And all these stories that you tell yourself don't actually exist here. They're just stories. They're not truth. Some have more relevance to truth. Like I'm sitting and speaking to a computer. That's how we would call it in language. But in actuality, right here, there is no computer. There is no speaking. There is no me. There is no you. There is nothing happening and seemingly everything happening. And this is absolute freedom. Like psychology and healing your body-mind mechanism is great, and I recommend doing all those things, but that won't ever lead you to the freedom of this moment. That's endless. This moment is so free and so pure and so open and so loving. Okay, I see I've been talking for quite a while. I will see if there's questions. Ah, here's someone put the quote. That's great. Nick. Thanks, Nick. Before one studies Zen, mountains are mountains and water are water. After a first glimpse into the truth of Zen, mountains are no longer mountains and waters are no longer water. After enlightenment, mountains are once again mountains and water once again water. Dogshen. Nice. But it's not quite the same as what I said, but about the real and the not real.